So we saw Russell's theory. We said that on Russell's theory, definite descriptions are basically a kind of quantifier. To say that the F is G is just to say that the unique thing, which is F, is also G. We're now going to see how this is supposed to help with the three puzzles that we started with. So the first puzzle that we saw was what we call the puzzle of non-existence. So let's quickly remind ourselves of what that was. So Russell was interested in a sentence like this: the King of France is bald. And Russell said that a sentence like the King of France is bald, well, this is a meaningful sentence. It's a false sentence. It's a false, meaningful sentence. And his puzzle was, well, how can that be if the King of France, its meaning should just refer to however that person is, but that person doesn't exist? If there is no King of France, how can this be a meaningful sentence? Russell's solution, given his theory of descriptions, is this. On Russell's theory, here's what that sentence says. There's exactly one King of France. And that guy is bald. Because remember, Russell told us in general what sentences involving descriptions like this mean. A sentence involving the description, the King of France is bald, that means there's exactly one King of France and that guy is bald. That clearly is meaningful, and it's false, because this bit is false. If there's no King of France, well then there can't be exactly one King of France. So Russell's theory tells us exactly how this sentence can be meaningful when there's no King of France, and why it would be false. What it means is just there's exactly one King of France and that guy is bald. That's meaningful whether there is a King of France or not, and it's false because there is no such guy. The second problem was the problem of informativity. So remember, it seemed like names and descriptions can say different things. It seems trivial to say that J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling. It's not trivial to say J.K. Rowling is the author of the Harry Potter books. Likewise, it seems trivial to say that Samuel Clemens is Samuel Clemens. It's not at all trivial to say that Samuel Clemens is the author of Huckleberry Finn. And as we said, it's difficult to see why in each case the sentences would say different things if the descriptions just referred to the person we were also naming. The reason why Russell solves this problem is because that's exactly what he denies. He says descriptions do not work like names. Descriptions are not ways of just picking out objects directly. Rather, when I say something like J.K. Rowling is the author of the Harry Potter books, what I'm saying is that there is a unique thing which is the author of the Harry Potter books, where there's one thing and one thing alone which authored the Harry Potter books, and that thing is J.K. Rowling. And that's a very different claim to the claim that J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling, that doesn't at all seem to say anything about whether there's a person that is the author of the Harry Potter books. So that's exactly why there's a difference on Russell's theory between the two sentences. Because, well, J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling, all that says is that the person J.K. Rowling is identical to themselves. But to say that J.K. Rowling is the author of the Harry Potter books makes instead this quantified claim. It says there's exactly one thing or exactly one person who is the author of the Harry Potter books, and that person is J.K. Rowling. And that's a very different claim from the trivial identity claim. And the more general point here, the more general reason why the description theory solves this problem about informativity is because you cannot in general replace a name with a description even if in actuality the description picks out the same person as the name. Let's just see a simple example. So let's just think about a case involving a lottery. So imagine we're in a room, a lottery is being drawn, and the winner has just been announced, but Alice didn't clearly hear who the winner is. Now, let's imagine the prize is really big. It's like, $1 million. So, because the prize is just so big, Alice knows that, well, whoever the winner is now rich. So, Alice knows the winner is now rich. But let's further suppose that the actual winner is Alice's best friend Carol. She just didn't hear the announcement properly and so just doesn't yet know that Carol is the winner. Can we say Alice knows that Carol is now rich? Well, clearly the answer is no, given how we describe the situation. Because Alice doesn't know that Carol is the winner. So this second sentence is just false. But notice that these two claims, they sort of talk about exactly the same person in reality. Carol just is the winner. And what this example shows us is that you cannot, in general, replace a name with a description in a sentence, even if they happen to pick out the same person in actuality. For instance, when we're making a claim about what Alice knows, we can't just replace the name with the description, because Alice may not know that this description picks out the same person that we're talking about with this name. So that is the key behind Russell's solution to the problem about informativity. The reason why J.K. Rowling is J.K. Rowling and J.K. Rowling is the author of the Harry Potter books, the reason why those two things don't mean the same thing is basically because of this fact that you cannot, in general, just replace a name with a description, even if the description does, as a matter of fact, pick out that thing. The last problem we're going to talk about is the problem about logic. We talked about this principle, the principle of excluded middle, which says that for any p, either p or not p is true. And we said that if descriptions just seem to work like names, it's hard to make sense of how the law of excluded middle could be true. Because, for instance, if you remember our example, the King of France is bald. If you divide up everything into the world into the category of the bald things and the not bald things, well, you're not going to find a King of France in either category. So how could the law of excluded middle be true? Now, Russell is able to give us an explanation of what's going on here, but we have to be careful about the scope. So let's take our sentence and think about it more carefully. In fact, we're going to think about the negation. The King of France is not bald. What Russell wants to say about this sentence is that, well, actually, depending on the scope of not with respect to the description, there's two very different ways of understanding the sentence, one of which is true and the other of which is false. Well, let's start off with the true reading of this. Here's one way Russell says we could understand this sentence. We could be saying, it's not the case that there is exactly one King of France, and that thing is bald. That's one way of understanding the claim that the King of France is not bald. And Russell thinks that this way of understanding it is true. It is indeed not the case that there is exactly one King of France and that thing is bald. And why is that? Well, because this bit is false. This is a conjunction. It says there is exactly one King of France and that thing is bald. But if you have some claim of the form P and Q, where P is false, then P and Q is also false. So it's false that there is exactly one King of France and that thing is bald, simply because, well, there isn't any King of France, so there can't be exactly one of them. But if that is false, then the claim that it's not the case that that must be true. So this entire sentence must be true, because what we have is not some conjunction where the first bit of the conjunction is false. It's not true that there's exactly one King of France, because there's no King of France. That's the true way of understanding the sentence. What's the false way of understanding the sentence? Notice on the first way of understanding the sentence, the way we paraphrased it is by putting the not in front and the bit corresponding to the King of France after the not. Russell thinks there's another way of hearing the sentence where we flip it around, where what we're saying is there is exactly one King of France, and that thing is not bald. So in this second way of understanding the sentence, Russell thinks the not is not, it's not sort of applying to the whole sentence. It's only applying to the bit about baldness. So all that's being negated is the sentence, or the bit, the kind of sentence fragment, that thing is not bald. So what the entire sentence says on the second way of understanding it is, there's exactly one King of France, and that thing is not bald. But of course, this claim is false. It's not true that there's exactly one King of France and that thing is not bald, because there's no King of France. It's the same reason why the first sentence was true. If there's no King of France, then there can't be exactly one King of France. But if there isn't exactly one King of France, then moreover, there isn't exactly one King of France who happens to not be bald. So what Russell says is, when we think about these claims involving not and descriptions, there's actually two ways of understanding them. One way, in general, when something like the King of France doesn't exist, one way of understanding it is going to be true, because you're saying it's not the case, there's exactly one King of France and nothing is bald. And that's true, because if there's no King of France, there isn't exactly one of them. But there's also a false thing, where you're saying there's exactly one King of France and that thing is not bald. And that's false for exactly the same reason that the first way of understanding the sentence was true. If there's no King of France, then there can't be exactly one King of France. But what has this all got to do with the law of excluded middle? Remember, what we were trying to explain is we wanted to somehow make sense of the idea that for any sentence P, either P is true or not P is true. And the issue was it's hard to make sense of how to do that with descriptions. Well, what Russell is saying is there are sort of two ways of understanding, when you have a description, what something like not P is really saying. You could be saying this or this. But on either way, you get that the claim is true or false. If you're interpreting it in the first way, the claim not P is true. If you're interpreting it the other way, the claim not P is false. But either way, the law of excluded middle is still going to hold. We don't have this problem where it looked like neither the King of France is bald, nor the King of France is not bald. We don't have a situation where neither of those is true. So that's Russell's solution to the problem involving the law of excluded middle. He says, well, if we think about descriptions involving negations, they're actually ambiguous. They give rise to the scope ambiguity that we talked about before, depending on whether you want to understand the not as coming before the description or as coming after the description. So if Russell is right about the solution to these three puzzles, that's a really nice motivation for his theory. We started with three things that really did seem quite puzzling, and Russell thinks he's given a solution to them involving his theory of descriptions as quantifiers. So remember, on Russell's theory, saying something like the f is g, that's saying there's exactly one thing which is f, and it is also g. And he's shown us, well, if that's how, that may not be initially how you would think of descriptions as working, but if you imagine that is how they worked, you would explain all these puzzling things about descriptions that we started with. I want to end this video on a question for you guys, because obviously we've been talking about names up until this point and not descriptions. But even though we're talking about descriptions this week, the puzzles that we talked about in particular are very closely related to a lot of the things we've been talking about before. So with Frege last week, we talked about the puzzle of empty names. That looks really like Russell's puzzle of non-existence. We also talked about Frege's arguments against Mill's theory. Again, those look really similar to the puzzle of informativity that Russell was talking about this week. Now, in the way I presented Russell's theory, he's arguing that descriptions really work like quantifiers rather than names. But my question for you is, does that really make sense given that the kind of puzzles we talked about for descriptions seem to also come up for names. We get a version of the puzzle of non-existence for names, that's just the problem of empty names. We also have a version of the puzzle of informativity, that was Frege's problem. So the question is it really right then? Does descriptions do work differently from names? And secondly, is there a way to use the tricks that we've learned today, to use the theory of descriptions, to solve perhaps the problems for names as well that we saw last week? That's something I'm not going to go into myself further this week. We're going to see exactly what the answer to that question is next week, but it's something I want you guys to start thinking about, because it's crucial to this question of what the relationship between descriptions and names is. And it's exactly why we spent this week talking about descriptions. Because we see that there are all these similar problems with descriptions, and Russell thinks he's come up with a good theory that solves the problems for descriptions. If that's right, then clearly a question we've got to ask ourselves is, well, maybe should we be applying Russell's theory of descriptions to names as well? And if so, how would that work?